We'll begin by a discussion between the three presenters on stage, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. I've been tasked with passing a microphone around, so I'll be down on in the audience once we've perhaps done some initial reactions to one another's presentations. I don't know if anybody has anything to pitch in just right off the bat. I noted a few things from each of your presentations that I thought were particularly that particularly grabbed my attention anyway. ARIA, you're basing your strategies on the recognition that digital culture is focused on practice as opposed to artifact was I thought really interesting. Oh, that's the end of your time, Mark. And also the emphasis on mass culture as opposed to institutionalization of particular works. Geneviève, I'm really interested to hear about how new approaches that are always more appropriate to the realities of digital artworks are gradually and steadily being adopted at the National Gallery. And I think it's really interesting that you recognize and act on the need to constantly reevaluate those strategies, to keep returning to earlier decisions and making sure that they are still pertinent to changing technological realities. And Mark, I was really captivated by the hands-on approach that you seem to take to all of your preservation projects. And it strikes me that the work that you do is in very direct and immediate conversation with the artists, and you're really engaging with the technological material in a way that speaks directly to the artist's own practice. And I wonder if any of you would have anything to say about those sort of key points that I found out, or that I found, or anything else that you'd like to add.
Well, so I had a meeting with Zachary, who's the director of Rhizome. You guys are doing excellent work, outstanding work. Dragon Espenchide, your director of preservation, great person, and so there's great efforts in emulation. And I met with Zachary and I said, Zachary, do we emulate or do we migrate? Yes. And so there's so many different cases and strategies.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I started working for Rhizome only 2 months ago right now. Nice. So it's been a wild ride, and like we jumped into this net art anthology project, and I think, yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think Dragon is amazing at what he does, and is like can speak for hours on it in such compelling ways. And I think that, yeah, I think it becomes very interesting because even already we've only done about 6 projects in the anthology, and like in terms of like each practice is so different, and in terms of like emulating or trying to migrate or like just documenting, there's always like I think we're already finding that this idea of like a hard and fast like emulation approach doesn't necessarily even work, because there's already like, you know, things that can't be, you know, approached that way. But yeah, I don't know, it's really interesting.
But there's also many things that's the only way you can approach, and we had some works by John Maeda, the Reactive Books, and these are pieces. He was it was in the era of the CD-ROM, a multimedia CD-ROM, and he wanted to push that. So he wrote these software pieces in C++ for Macintosh OS 9, and they were exploring the interactivity of the computer, the trackpad, and the little ball quick cam at the time, and things like that. And so the curators wanted to show them, and they're like, well, you know, Maeda's like, I don't know the source code. And, you know, that was dealing with interactivity at with the IMAX at the time, and so I've moved on, and so that was perfect. And so we did approach that in emulation.
Yeah, and I think it also it works well for at least like a lot of the artists we've worked with so far, who didn't necessarily do the work to preserve like the code or whatever, because that wasn't what they were interested in necessarily, or because they didn't have the capabilities. And so I think that this solution does work well with dealing with that as well, when like they don't have like an archive sitting around that like like, oh yeah, here, just like do this. But then it becomes very, I don't know, I'm really interested. We had a meeting with Ben Fino-Radin at MoMA also, and we were talking about working on presenting the thing and like how do you do that, and which is like would be an extremely intense like expansive project. And I think again, returning to this idea of like practice, it's like for me as like as a curator, I'm really fascinated by the idea of like where does the practice end, and do we have to recreate the entire message board and everything that happened there in order to do that? So
would you say that there's already knowledge existing or perhaps currently developing around in which kinds of cases an emulation approach should be favored over a migration approach? I mean, is there a cheat sheet for like what are the cases in which we would favor migration? Oui, Geneviève.
I think they are, especially with when the artwork is actually a sculpture. It actually has an aesthetic component to it, and also I think it's important in some ways that to keep the historical context, especially when an artwork is on exhibition. Like at the gallery, we try to show films from the 1960s on their original format, because on a flat screen TV doesn't make any sense, and the visitor is actually like doesn't understand what's happening. They just think it's a shitty video on a very nice TV. So in that context, I think that's sometimes like emulation is like the right thing to do over migration, but it's not always possible.
And what are the limiting cases? Like, what are some of the impediments that you find to continuing to show work in the exact format in which the artist had devised it?
Can you repeat it?
Well, you say that there are limits, that sometimes it's not possible to show the work exactly in the way that the artist had intended. So. What are some of those? What are some of those cases, and can you talk about maybe how compromises can be found?
Well, compromises, like there's always, it's like emulation. It's like basically faking old technology, like encasing new technology in old ones. It's like a lot of tape cassette players can hide MP3 players in them, and then you just have them running. So, yeah.
I think there's this debate, is it the same work? I was working with the museum, and they had some Java applets, and they wanted me to do some research on how to emulate them in the web browser. So I built this Linux server and put it on Amazon, and it launches up a headless web browser that supports Java applets. And then it just renders out in the user's canvas, and I was like, that's a lot of work to preserve the applet. The artist is still alive. Just have them port it to JavaScript. And then so we had this debate, like, that's not the same piece. And I was like, is it the same piece when we build this entire like base underneath it, and then show it in in this particular web browser through this layer? Again, I'm open to both, but there's some debate here. And then, at what point is it where it needs to get shown? Because the thing with NetArt is like you might have looked on Netscape Navigator, you might have looked at it in Opera and Chrome, all these different browsers, and they might have rendered slightly different. So.
I think something else that I've been coming across and working with artists is the varied approach to the hardware also, or like how important that is to different artists. Like some people, like for instance, we recreated My Boyfriend Came Back from the War without like, you know, the same kind of desktop computer that it would have been shown on in like '96. But then some people who saw the work were like, well, why isn't it on that computer? And we were like, well, we don't, like, we're a digital institution, we don't have an exhibition space. And then we did the file room. Anthony Muntadas was like, oh, I wish we'd had a file, like an installation, because initially it was like this like whole room that you would enter. And so that's something that's really, like for us is hard, because we're a pretty small organization, and we don't have access to a physical space all the time. But sometimes these works, in some people's eyes, require that aspect, but then like and again, like what is that the work, or is it the, you know, practice that developed? I don't know. It's everything is confusing, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think there's a lot of artists, like they have like a very aesthetic mind, when sometimes like as like curators or conservators, like we think more technically, how can we reproduce that? We had some instances at the gallery where like we were upgrading the projectors for some video projections, and we found out later on that the artists like weren't happy about that, because there were subtleties that older projectors, like a quality of the image that it was giving, that he liked, and that's why he chose that kind of projector. So sometimes migrating and upgrading technology is not a aesthetical solution that is approved by the artists either.
One thing I thought was really interesting about the approach that you take, and I've heard about it from Licha Gagné as well, is you talked about the artist questionnaire, like a certain number of questions that are asked of the artist prior to acquisition. And I think that seems to me like a key practice that to a sustainable approach to long-term conservation of works, because as Aria was just saying, you know, the approaches that different artists may have to technology is always very different, and unless you've explicitly made clear what the artist's attitudes are towards, you know, a particular piece of hardware, a particular projector, a particular presentation interface, all of these things become, I think, really crucial to the downstream long-term conservation of the work.
I would say short-term conservation of the work. We do artist interviews and ask them, like, in 500 years, where do you see your artwork? And, you know, like, give them the worst-case scenarios of what can be done, what cannot be done. But we always have to keep in mind that these artworks are under copyright laws. So whenever we're doing a major intervention on those artworks, we need to work with the artists, and artists change their minds. And I don't want to generalize, but there's a lot of artists that, you know, it's like they're not as active as they used to be, so often they want to upgrade their artwork technologically so they can be amongst the new young hot artists. And so there is always, it's like we can't use those artist interviews and documentation as like fixed information that's going to basically direct the restoration and conservation of those artworks.
Well, we had an interesting work at SF MoMA. It's a piece called Victor by Jörg Lenny, and it's this great robot, and it has these motorized wheels, and it basically draws vector graphics on the wall, and it runs on a little ARM-based board, not unlike a Raspberry Pi, but there's a lot of complex software with it, and so one interesting aspect that the conservator worked out with Jörg is they have a shared source code repository. He's a Swiss artist. He's very Swiss, and so he's always wants to upgrade and tweak the software. And in this in the source code repository, you have snapshots of the code every time it changes, and you can revert back and things like that. And so we presented that at the Guggenheim last year, and some thought that was controversial because the art should remain as it was upon acquisition. And in many ways it does in the source code repository, but it does need maintenance and tweaking as well. So Martina, the conservator, allows for Jörg to actively contribute new source code patches to this work.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor. Is anyone reacting to? Okay.
Thank you. So, well, this is a question for all of you, but related to the net art ontology. I was reading the presentation text about the idea to sketch a possible canon of net art. So in all these preservation efforts, which I see this is a bit in the context in which we now have the pre-net art from some years. Ars Electronica launched this Digital Pioneers Award. So this effort to write the history, tell which are the main artworks, etc. So there is all this part about setting up, telling to the future which would be the artworks that are worth preserving. And I wonder how you deal with this, how you deal with the decision of saying which artworks are worth all this tremendous effort of preservation and which would be forgotten, will disappear.
Well, I think for us, yeah, in launching the project initially, it was a big question, did we want to say that part of the effort was to, craft a canon in some sense? And I think we realized that, if you're presenting 100 works of net art, and there's visibility for it, that's kind of something that just embedded in the project. And so we decided that we would admit to that and take it on. But I think that our goal is to, well, part of the project is to leave the submission, open submission. So we have an email address on the website where we're asking people to, give feedback. And it's also part of why it's not 2 years of research leading up to one exhibition where all the works are presented together. It's like a rolling basis where, what gets presented, now will inform what happens, 6 months from now. It's kind of shifting and flowing. But yeah, I don't know. I think that it is hard. People are already well, is this going to be included? This should be included. And I think it's very fraught territory. But our goal is to, while we're doing that, I think releasing the Old Web Today tool to the public and having that be something that's in the conversation. We're holding, in February, we're holding a conference on digital social memory. And sort of alongside this idea of the canon, create releasing tools and making people aware of tools to archive their online artwork or just general online experience, and continuing to hold the digital as a mass medium in our minds and to make that part of the conversation alongside of it. Because I don't think we want to present it as this is the canon, this is the hard and fast top 100 net artworks to know, that kind of thing. But yeah.
Other reactions to that question?
I'm supposed to restore everything equally because the collection of the galleries, basically, it's Peoples of Canada collection. You pay for it with your taxes. But like I said in the presentation, we do risk assessment based on technology obsolescence to determine priorities. And another thing that we also consider very importantly is if the artists are still here or are going to be here with us for a long time or not when we decide to undertake our restoration projects.
Can I add, sorry, also for Rhizome, I think another thing is that we're interested in paying particular attention to practices that are in danger of being lost because of various factors, as well as highlighting artists who at the time maybe didn't get much attention for what they were doing, or also a lot of projects that at the time didn't seem particularly interesting, but now because of the way things have progressed have come back in terms of their relevance. So.
Yeah, I think both approaches are amazing. I've been showing a lot of colleagues lately the processing.org of the Processing Language Exhibition and how you can't run any of this history of creative coding exhibition, from 1999 till whenever Apple isn't around anymore. And a lot of these artists, you know, they've moved on and not accessible. And these works are not in the collections of institutions, but they have a great importance in this history. Works by Casey Riaz, Josh On, all these works. And so I think in Rhizome's approach, it's very important, very beneficial, you know, to this field. But I also understand the institution. Sometimes I'm known as the Agent Ruby guy, and I'll probably be working on Agent Ruby for the rest of my life. But the point with Ruby is it's an institution, and so it's constant research, and we see the life cycle of this work, and we pay really close attention. And I work for Lynn, and she's still alive, and so I can. You know, I can interview her and talk to her and work in her studio, and so it's a very privileged place, and I really enjoy it. So both, I think, I'm an advocate for.
Some more questions? We'll go in the back first and then here.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. They were very interesting. I'm interested in this question of sort of authenticity of emulations and migrated artwork. I'm the digital archivist here at the CCA, and it's something that we think about a lot with obsolete CAD software that also won't run in contemporary environments. But you can look at it a lot of ways. Like, even if you have a fully authentic emulated experience, the experience of looking at that on a CRT monitor, like you were saying earlier, versus on a Retina screen on a modern MacBook Pro is always going to be pretty different. So I'm wondering what, excuse me, what efforts you're taking to communicate these differences to the public, or to, especially in the case of a migration, maybe make transparent the work that you're doing and what effects it might have on the artwork itself.
Okay, I can start. When works of art on our exhibition, the first thing that you'll notice is that there's a didactic, like carton on the wall that says when the work was recreated and when it was rebuilt. And we also put a description of the original technology and the new technology. It's very important for us to do that, because if I don't know, if we change a light bulb, we won't do that, like from incandescent to LED. But if there's like a major migration, if the work has changed completely, then we do make it aware to people.
Hello. Hi. I have two questions, which is always a terrible start question, but you can pick which one you want to answer. The first is, have you ever encountered an artist who, you know, I think back to the Fluxus artists in the 1960s and then the video artists that proceeded to follow them, where there was an intent for the work to disintegrate. They were ephemeral works, and they sort of, that death of the artwork was a part of the intent of creating the work. Have you encountered artists that simply don't want their work preserved, that would like to see it have a graceful death and perhaps a funeral? And then two, are you starting to encounter, I'm an artist who works on the internet, and a lot of works recently start to integrate public APIs or work with outside servers and services. And I'm wondering if you've started to encounter that friction of working with IBM or Google to preserve artworks, and what their responsibility might be in future archiving and restoration. Thanks.
So to the first question, so we worked with, we're working with John Maeda's Reactive Books. John Maeda is a really luminary in digital media, and he made these pieces, in the late '90s, and each one, one was about interacting with a trackpad, which was really innovative at the time. Trackpads were brand new on those Lime iMacs, and the webcam and the QuipCam, and so he had a video one, and so he made these 4 books about interactivity with a computer. And actually NYU and Glenn Wharton at NYU, the students interviewed John Maeda, because the Reactive Books are also in the collection at the moment. And he's like, well, these were about innovative interactions at the time. Now everybody, it's not innovative anymore. And the interviews online, and he wasn't really interested in their preservation sometimes he's like, just make a video. And so that was interesting. Like the interpretation people are going to have is totally changed. And he's moved on because of that. So that was one encounter.
I haven't yet encountered an artist who doesn't want to recreate their work. But in terms of the dealing with like Google and stuff like that, I haven't dealt with that yet. But there is a piece that I think we will have to deal with it with or something similar. That Anne Hirsch made an app that was censored a few years ago, and I think I'm really interested in trying to figure out how to make that work again. If it would mean like trying to create a censored version or dealing with like the iTunes or Apple Store and being like, I don't know. So that I think that could become interesting because then talking to her, she was like, I don't want to do it if it's not interactive. Like that doesn't, it's not the work. So it'd be interesting.
No, I never encountered an artist that wanted to let his artwork die, especially in type-based media. Like it's interesting though that ephemeral practices, I never encountered them in that type of art.
I'm surprised to hear that, given that many artists go into work with unstable media, fully cognizant of the fact that these things are not designed to last for decades or centuries.
Yeah, it isn't their problem after it's not theirs anymore. A lot of artists are like, you deal with it. Like they don't want any ownership of it after that.
But I think we're seeing new, interesting responses from artists, namely Raphael Lozano-Hemmer and Casey Riaz, who have published manifestos on the conservation of software-based art and the artist's responsibility. And I was talking to Casey Riaz at Opening San Francisco, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm porting some of my works." So
yeah, I think also like in like more recent practices, also there like the like sort of social media based things are like the jogging on Tumblr or like Twitter based practices where I think at the time a lot of people are like really interested in how the work functions as a mass medium that can just get lost in the feed or whatever. But given like I think I've heard many of like the jogging members really wish that they could have more of an archive of that than just like the way it is, or with like Twitter poetry. How do you archive that when it's just amidst like I ate oatmeal for breakfast, and what are the objects that are worth preserving or not? Yeah, so the problem only gets harder, I think, with social media as well.
More questions? I don't see any hands. I'd ask a question about, it's sort of more of a structural question, I guess. One thing about the techniques that are brought to bear to preserve works is that they tend to be very custom, very particularized to the nature of a specific work. And I think an initiative like Old Web Today is really interesting because it solves a set of problems as opposed to a single one. And so I'm basically wondering about how this kind of work of conserving and preserving digital art, how it can be scalable. How can a solution be applied more generally, especially in a context where there's very limited funding available. The National Gallery is a major institution that is able to do work on a custom artist-to-artist basis because there's a few hundred works in the collection. But what happens when that number grows to the thousands or the tens of thousands? How do the strategies need to evolve in order to be sustainable at those kinds of scales?
At the gallery, what we're doing right now is basically we're not doing full migrations, but what we're doing is basically technology transfers that will enable us to do full migrations. So when works of art are not planned for any activities, so we do the minimum work that is necessary to make sure that these works evolve in time and also can be restored in the future. Yeah, because it's, like you said, it's every work of art is very complex, and like material has been used or hacked by artists, so it's a case-to-case thing, and sometimes these projects can take up months and years to achieve, and then once you're done, then you kind of have to redo it again because technology has already changed. So what we do is just we try to basically bring that artwork onto a stable platform and without doing full migrations.
But I guess what I'm wondering is, because the amount of money invested, let's say, per project restored, it doesn't seem like it reduces with scale, right? You don't have, once you've solved a problem, you haven't necessarily solved, the problems of dozens of other artworks. You do have to start over and over and over again. And given that there is so little funding that's available, at least in Canada, for the preservation of media art, how do we, what other possible solutions exist to arrive at a more stable ecosystem?
Well, I think, at Rhizome, something that we are doing, another project we have is this web recorder project, which is like a online archiving tool. So that's sort of, I guess, in a way, this preemptive strategy, I suppose. So giving people the tools to archive their online activity and create just like a living archive of that, which can be used by artists to try to, I don't know, but I don't know that I don't think it solves it, but I think it's like some element of this world of like the problem. And I think like just sort of expanding the conversation, or I think what we're trying to do is expand the conversation around, broadly speaking, digital social memory, such that the artists that we are involved with also start to think like, oh, maybe it's worth it for me to go back and look at that project and try to figure out like what other ways I could archive it, and so that everyone's kind of on the same page, so that doesn't happen when it's in danger of being lost. But like, for instance, like the platform Vine was just shut down, and there were so many like short little videos that are kind of little art objects unto themselves, and like these like ongoing practices by these people who really mastered the form. But now like Vine says that archive will stay up, but who knows what will happen. So we're really trying to be in dialogue with people about, okay, like you can use this tool to archive your online practice such that like you hold it. It's not like we as an institution hold on to it necessarily. Like this is like your like activity, which also presents like an ethical problem about like like leaving a trace online or whatever. But yeah, that's something that we're trying to do, and is like a drop in the bucket, I think, in terms of solving that.
A lot of those artworks are interactive, and some research centers now are filming navigations. Not only, they don't want to only preserve the art piece, but they want also to preserve the interaction. So how people are interacting, and that at the beginning of the project, and later, years after, how people can interact too. So where is the documentation or the preservation of interaction, where you can put that thing in your strategies to conserve the art?
I'm going to say something that's going to sound very funny, but there was an effort for like documenting interaction and the experience of the user, and we do it whenever we can. But we also save all our security videos at the gallery and add them in the conservation files.
creative use of resources?
I don't know if it's legal.
So, the role of documentation in preserving interactive works. Any other thoughts on that?
Things that I was watching the video game exhibition at MoMA, and they were showing Tetris, and there was a small child who didn't know what to make of it or how to interact with it, and I don't know how to do that. And then a funny anecdote: the room vehicle house they put it on the Facebook campus for a while. And the technician from Gregland Studios like, yeah, and they would just try and jump in it. So that's like an interaction you wouldn't want. But no, I haven't thought about like, what is the proper way? Is it driven by the viewer? Or is it prescribed? I guess it could be either, depending on the artwork. But no, I haven't thought about that, but I will think about that going forward.
Yeah, I think that when I start thinking about that question, I get into this very slippery slope of like considering the art object historically in its entirety, and like, you know, like, yeah, like, well then, like, what about the interaction between, you know, yeah, like the viewer and an architectural space, or the viewer and like a sculpture, and then it becomes really stressful. But I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, it's something that I think practically speaking hasn't been of the greatest concern thus far, but I think is an important question.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations. They've been fantastic. One of the things that people keep coming back to here is this idea of an official narrative, an official record of this part of the story of art. And I think it's quite clear, or at least to me it seems apparent, that due to the very rapid pace of change in formats, from floppy disks and from previous kind of styles of digital media to what's happening now, that we've already lost an enormous chunk. I have no idea what the percentage would be, but there is a great deal of that that's not being captured, not being archived, and not being recorded. Do you feel that there is a need for a centralized museum, institution, database of some kind, as I do? And if so, and the much thornier question is, who should run it? Where should it be? And with what tools? But at the moment, I would, if you agree, I would suggest that we are capturing and preserving and curating a very tiny percentage of the story of digital art.
Let's start a museum.
Who should run the World Digital Art Museum?
I think there should be, and then my question too is who's going to do it. I think that we've talked about having central repositories in museums, but you know, the cultures are all very different, all different administrative, and then there's funding. But I think it'd be a good idea, not a central knowledge base, and so I advocate that as well.
Yeah, I think it would be great. I think it'd be very difficult, and I don't know who could undertake it. And likewise, especially with digital art, figuring out what goes in it, like what counts as art or art enough to be in the central database is vexing. But yeah, would be cool.
It leads to a question also of how works are activated, you know, like because any kind of platform interacts with its audience, and the audience of the National Gallery of Canada is not the same as the audience of Rhizome. And I think that the point of keeping work alive is to continue to animate and grow those audiences, but I think those audiences are also in many ways particular and specific. So there's, I think, a community dimension to any large-scale endeavor to preserve work because of the communities from which these works arise and also the communities to which they're directed?
Yeah, I think at Rhizome especially, that's always in our minds. Like, there's such a rich community that's been, like, it's been such a hub for like the last 20 years, and there are people who are like super invested in what happens at Rhizome. And I think in my eyes, like the Net Art Anthology project is this sort of like, not like yearbook, but it is this like community resource in a way, and sort of giving people like a shout out, like, you know, for the things that, yeah, it's interesting.
Anything else? Some other comments or questions or perspectives? Oui, Aurélie.
So basically, all of you worked with the artist when you had to preserve the artworks or to re-engineer it, etc. I was wondering if you actually already went in the situation that the artist was not alive anymore, and what like difficulties that was to really know how to make the artwork again, or etc. And or like when you mentioned that, for example, at the museum, at the gallery, you have interviews that you make with artists, but do you already like know that there are some aspects that are really difficult to keep, you know, in the archive to present again the artworks, if you have examples, for example?
Example of when artists are no longer alive and then restoration projects had to be done. It's a lot more work. What we usually do is try to find other institutions that have artworks from the same era, from the same artists, and that the artists collaborated for the restoration of it. So that's the first step that we undertake. Like I said earlier, there's copyright laws, and so we have to basically talk to the estate of the artists and ask them for permission to do changes, migrations, or emulation. This can get a little bit complicated because there's a lot of estates that are not interested, or that actually are hard to work with, not really understanding, let's say, you know, it's like that if they don't understand the technology, then it's going to be very difficult to have rights from them to do those kinds of restoration work. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't worked with anyone who's passed away yet for this project.
I guess maybe just in conclusion, unless there's any other questions, I'm sort of interested in knowing how different actors in digital art preservation are managing to work together. I feel like there's a lot of good work that happens in a disparate and decentralized way. There was an interesting question just now about, you know, the need to centralize this work, perhaps in the form of a database or something along those lines. We don't, in Canada, we no longer have a national preservation strategy as such. This is something that has been attempted several times and keeps falling by the wayside. There was a lot of very interesting work, which was, I guess you could say, centralized at DOCAM for a few years. What are the legacies of those sorts of initiatives, and how do what networks do people use to exchange practices and knowledge and to continue to work together?
So there's an alliance between MoMA, SF MoMA, and the Tate. It's called Matters in Media Art, and we just pushed out a new a site, mattersinmedia.org, and this is all about, in this case, storage and management for video art and large digital assets. We talk about storage strategies, geographically distributed backup strategies, managing your collection, dams, and all these other Archivematica and trusted repositories. So we've been doing that, and we decided to publish it on GitHub and be open source and things like that. And the DOCAM model was great. I remember being at the DOCAM Summit in 2010. Smithsonian has their time-based media working group, and so that's a collection of resources and things. But what I do see is, there's funding and there's initiative, and then you get this great, site, this great repository, and then it kind of loses funding and goes away. So how do we get beyond that? And I thought maybe that's just a question of the human condition and funding, but so.
Yeah, there's different resources, like Inca actually publish artist interviews regarding like preservation and restoration of their artworks. There's a few conservation associations that have time-based media under groups that also publish quite a bit of information that is available to anybody that is interested.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our presenters, and thanks very much to everyone who came out and participated.